A lot of people think that common land is publicly owned, but it isn't. Common land, at least in its traditional British English meaning, is privately owned land over which other people have certain rights, typically things like for grazing animals, for collecting wood, or in some places for digging peat or fishing, for example. The history of Langford Heathfield Common is fairly typical for a lowland English common. Like most of them, it began as manorial waste, in this case part of the manor of Langford Budville, that was uncultivated land used by tenants of the manor for the useful resources it offered. The most recent owners of Langford Budville Manor were the Sandford family of Ninehead Court, just a few miles away. In the late 20th century, again like a lot of commons, Langford Heathfield became valued for its wildlife habitat and was designated a Site of Special Scientific Interest, or SSSI. It was around then that it was bought from the Sandfords by the Somerset Wildlife Trust. We met up with David Northcote Wright on the Common, who told us more.
Yeah, thanks for coming down today, David. We got you down here really just to ask you a little bit about the Common and its history and how you manage it.
We bought it in two parts. So because it's actually, we call the site Langford Heathfield, and the common land area we bought in 1982.
Okay.
Which is about 70 hectares.
Mm-hmm.
And then we added a further around about 20 hectares in 1985, two areas of woodland, Corums and Lucas's Copse,
Oh, right.
which aren't actually part of the common, although
Right.
they're part of the Site of Special Scientific Interest and they're part of the trust ownership.
We've brought you down to this particular bit because you said this bit has recently been cut. Can you tell us what's going on in terms of management and how you're managing?
Yeah, well the reserve is sort of a mosaic of different habitats, and this is a really good example here. So you've got the grassland area we're actually standing on, which is, although in December doesn't look that much, in the summer is alive with wildflowers, invertebrates. You know, there's species such as knapweed, there's common spotted orchid, there's twayblade orchids, there's yellow rattle, a whole range of stuff, and they support a load of sort of really nice butterflies, moths, beetles, and other invertebrates, half of which we probably don't even know about.
Yeah.
And adjacent to those, you have this sort of woodland. This is what we call secondary woodland. So this has come up on areas that were previously grazed as part of the common. So the site was actually, the whole site was grazed by the local commoners. The grazing ceased in the 1950s. And in order to maintain, we're trying to maintain a mix of the different habitats. So instead of having a sort of vertical woodland edge up into tall trees against the grassland, we keep areas coppice, so you get that sort of low shrubby edge.
Yes.
You can see areas across here which we've done previously, and you get that sort of low bushy growth, because that is really valuable for a lot of the species a lot of what we think of as our garden birds.
Yes.
Blackbirds, robins, wrens, the blue tits, things, they live in those sort of habitats.
What will you do with all this brush that you've cut down?
That's just left.
And that will rot down?
That rots down within a few years, that's gone. It creates a habitat while it's there.
Yes.
Again, things like chiff-chaff, wrens and whatnot will nest in that in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Small mammals use it. And the other big advantage of leaving it is it acts as protection against the new shoots coming up off the coppice stool being browsed off by roe deer.
So this is probably quite a traditional way of protecting coppice when it's
Well,
really growing.
not really, to be perfectly honest, no. Most of that would have been used historically
For firewood?
for firewood, for kindling, for a whole range of uses depending on what it was. And the coppice would have been protected probably by people wandering around protecting it.
More labour.
More
Yeah.
labour,
Oh,
child
that's
labour
interesting.
very often.
Yes.
So that they would have used it. But we have no use for it now, unfortunately.
Tell me, when this was bought by the Wildlife Trust, what would it have looked like? Are you saying there would have been no woodland here at all?
Oh no, there was woodland here, because although the last grazing ceased here in the 1950s, grazing declined probably from the late 19th century.
Yeah.
So yes, many of these trees here are 150, even 200 years old. The grassy areas would probably have been quite overgrown. because they say that grazing had ceased and hadn't, so there would have been a lot more bracken in the open areas, and we've controlled that over many years. The structure wasn't so clearly defined, so there was a scattering of scrub and things within the grasslands as well, which we've cleared in order that we can cut it. So yeah, it looked quite a bit different.
So it had basically been completely left for about 30 odd years.
Yes.
Before the Wildlife Trust.
It had, yes.
On.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're not taking it back to any particular point in history. What you're doing is more about managing it for wildlife sort of now, like
Yes.
how you took it
Yeah,
on. You're
yeah.
making the most of what you took on.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're playing
Yeah.
to the strengths of what we had when we acquired the site. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not trying to take it back, and that ties in also with the Site of Special Scientific legislation, where when it's notified, the site has is given a citation sheet. It's called, all very boring,
Yes,
but
I've seen
that's
those.
basically a list of the species and habitats that are on the site and the rationale for why they're important. So maintaining and encouraging those is a key part of managing a triple SI.
Right.
And as that was done just before we acquired it, it tied in quite well with our management aims of where we're trying to keep the site, if you like. So we're trying to maintain it at a certain point rather than restore it back to a mythical point in the past.
Okay.
So the common is managed as it would have been 30 years ago, and in accord with the SSSI requirements. But some of those requirements may conflict with commoners' rights, such as change to the grazing regime, removal or cutting of plant materials such as firewood, and extraction of minerals like peat or clay.
Do you have any idea why the grazing would have stopped up here? Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I do, yeah. Partly changing agricultural practices. Common grazing across the whole country declined during that period.
Mm-hmm.
Here specifically, it was road casualties with the animals, because the common in those days would have been gated at both ends of the main road here and at the end of the little Carrier's Lane.
Yes.
In fact, the house at the end up there is still called Carrier's Gate, because it had the gate outside it for onto the road on the common.
Yeah.
And as the volume and speed of traffic increased, the number of animals being killed on the road became untenable. And also, as the volume of traffic increased, people increasingly didn't bother shutting the gates, and so the animals wandered the countryside. So that was the sort of final nail in the coffin of the common grazing here.
That's quite fascinating, isn't it? So in one sense, traffic sort of hastened the end of lowland commoning. You might
Yeah, it was certainly a factor. Yeah, more of a factor in some, because some commons put in cattle grids, obviously, and still have them. New
like
Forest
New
you were talking about
Forest.
earlier, yeah. And a lot of the upland commons in northern England, you drive over a cattle grid, don't you? You climb up the hill onto the top.
Yes.
But a lot didn't, and those were much more vulnerable.
So but I guess when it was being used intensively for commoning, they may well have had people up here, as you were saying. They may well have had perhaps even children looking after animals up here.
Yeah, they probably did, yes. And again, that probably gradually declined as society maybe became more enlightened about the use of child labour, and the number of people working in the countryside declined due to economic reasons, agricultural practices changing, etc. Commons nowadays, the animals just tend to be put out there and left, don't they, and then rounded up once or twice a year for veterinary reasons. That's about it. So that is a very different style of common grazing to probably the original sort of 18th, 19th century common grazing.
What about in terms of the ecology of the place? So, I mean, you're probably reluctant to judge sort of different ecological states, I imagine, but I'm just wondering how, if this was all grazed by commoners in the past, how would that have compared in terms of ecological variety to how it is now?
Very difficult to say.
Yeah, I
very
thought you'd
difficult to say. We have some evidence that it was probably in certain periods overgrazed.
Yes.
Because there were bylaws put in by the then owners in 1890, I've forgotten exactly, but round about then, actually to allow areas of the common to be temporarily fenced for periods of up to 18 months to exclude livestock.
Okay.
Now my hunch is the only logical reason I can think they would do that is if they felt it was being overgrazed.
Yeah.
So in periods like that, some of the wildlife that's here now would have struggled, if
Yes.
everything was grazed really tightly. But what's probably happened, the most likely explanation for why it's so rich now and has such a mix, is the countryside around about would have been much more wildlife friendly. And as that became more wildlife unfriendly, species probably moved into here as being the last island of suitable habitat.
Yes.
So that's our best guess of what happened, because species like marsh fritillary butterfly, for example, small pearl bordered fritillary, wouldn't have survived under a very tight grazing regime.
Yeah.
But they may well have been in surrounding fields and then moved in here as the grazing eased off in here and increased out there.
That's interesting.
So because they're mobile species.
Yeah.
And most of the sort of woodland, the secondary woodland species we've got here, whilst interesting and unfortunately, sadly becoming rare, 100 years ago would not have been rare. So they were quite common species that would have been widespread in hedgerows, small copses around the country, even areas of scrub around the country generally.
Because of the way people were farming.
Because farming was much more environmentally friendly.
Yes.
It wasn't sort of big business farming in the way it is today.
What would happen to this common if it was just left? So if the Wildlife Trust decided not to do anything, what would happen to it?
It would just wood up. And in 100 years' time, it would pretty well be total woodland cover. Just maybe with a couple of small gaps where it was particularly wet seasonally or something and the trees didn't grow very well. But yeah, basically it would become secondary woodland.
So in terms of habitat for wildlife, would that be, again, you're probably reluctant to say whether it would be better or worse, but it would be different, I guess.
It would be different. No, I know I'm quite happy to say it'd probably be poorer, wildlife poorer.
Okay.
Because while some species would benefit, all the sort of open ground species would largely disappear. So it would benefit some species, but overall the species diversity would be less.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear really on a number of sites where that has happened.
It seems to me that it's lucky that you guys are here to maintain habitats like this. One of my thoughts was that it's kind of a little bit ironic that people were maintaining a habitat here in the past because they were using it for food essentially.
Yep.
And now we're actually having to do that through a charity, and most of what it's
Yep.
used for, apart from the wildlife environment, is for leisure use.
Yeah.
I just wondered
Yeah.
if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's a tragedy, really, that we now have a total disconnect between agriculture, forestry, and what we call nature conservation.
So from what David told us, the common was pretty much neglected from the 1950s because of a change in farming practices and lifestyles, and because of the rise of the motor car. But although it's no longer being used by commoners, there are still commoners with registered rights here. In 1965, the Commons Registration Act required all common land and common rights to be registered. Common rights are almost always attached to properties, and for Langford there are 7 properties with registered rights. 5 of them are farms, 1 is a cottage, and 1 is a random field. Farms I could understand, as they're all close to the common, but why just 1 cottage out of all the houses in Langford Budville? And why just 1 random field? Surely there were more commoners in the past.
On the Common Rights Register, there's about 8 commoners still listed.
Yeah,
Do you have any contact with those? Have you ever had
I
any
do.
contact
Yes,
with them?
yes. With quite a few of them, I do. Yes. Yeah.
And do they have any involvement now?
No, not on the ground. The only involvement they have is a number of them have claimed the single farm payment for the common, because if you have common rights, you can claim a proportion of the single farm payment attached to your own land for the common. So they are still claiming that.
In terms of acreage of what
Yes.
they're farming?
Yes.
That's
But
interesting.
they don't have to do anything for that.
So they get the money and you do the work?
Yes. Yeah, I know.
One farm that was missing on the list used to belong to a friend of mine.
Hi, Leary.
Hi, Mandy.
This is my friend Leary. He used to live in a farm just opposite the common, and I'm hoping he's going to tell us about that and about the commoners' rights that were attached to it.
Well, it was called Bindenholme Farm. It was part of an estate belonging to Binden House in Victorian times. My father bought Binden House in 1962 when he retired. My father changed the name from the Larches to Bindenholme Farm
Oh, right.
in a sort of idea to encapsulate the old sort of idea of the Binden estate.
Yes.
There was a Binden Lodge at the bottom of the drive, a Binden Bungalow, and there was a Binden Farm, which was separate. We started off as a bit of a hippie, self-sufficient commune in the early days. And I heard about grazing rights from our neighbour Tom Prescott, who he also had grazing rights, and it was in the grazing rights are in the deeds, not in the person. So I inherited, or my father inherited the grazing rights.
So by that you mean the rights to graze animals on the common was attached to the farm,
Attached
to the
to
land.
the property, yeah.
Yeah. Were those rights attached to Binden House or Binden Home Farm or both?
Bindenholme Farm,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
or what used to be the Larches.
Yeah. But did you ever use those rights?
You know, for me, I know my neighbour Tom Prescott, he wanted to keep all his, and I actually didn't feel it was of any use
Yeah.
to what we were doing. I received correspondence from Wellington Town Council saying that all farmers that had rights on the common needed to register them. And the next thing I know, the Somerset Wildlife Trust, is it? Or was it? It was,
Yeah, it's a wildlife trust, yeah.
they took over management of it. And I actually supported very much what they were doing because, you know, you could see the effect of climate change, you could see the effect of intensive farming. And I thought it was more important that this place be managed for wildlife conservation. And, you know, and from that point of view, I was quite happy to let my grazing rights go.
Yeah, fair enough.
We also managed to track down a commoner who decided to keep his rights in the 60s.
My name is John Cottrell, and I farm with my family at Langford Budville near Wellington, where we used to keep dairy cows. We've now sold those and closed our milk retail business, so we're now general farming, arable farming, and a few stock. When I left school, which is a long time ago, but when I left school, there were 17 farms in Langford Budville parish milking cows. We sold our cows last year. There's now one.
Really?
One farm left in this parish milking cows.
Wow. Because you had Guntonham Dairy, I believe, didn't you?
We did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we did. Built that up over many years, 94 years that was going.
Yeah, and that was
My grandfather started with a pony and trap.
really.
Yep.
And what rights do you still have, and what land are they attached to?
Well, the commoners' rights are attached to land and not to people. So whoever happens to own the land has the ancient common rights. And where we live here at Gundenham Farm has common rights, and some land we have the other side of the village also has common rights. And the rights we have are the rights to graze on Langford Heathfield, giving it its proper title. And we have Estover rights and we have Turberry rights. So we have the right to cut timber for our use on the farm, not for selling or burning. And we have rights to the grazing rights that I mentioned.
Okay, so the Estovers, that would be for things like fencing and mending buildings.
Gate posts, fencing, that type of thing, yes.
So my understanding is that back in the 1960s,
Yes.
you were required to register your rights. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There was a general move by the government at that time for all people with common rights to, if they wanted to retain them, to re-register them. And I wanted to retain them, not that I want to go felling timber for gateposts or fencing or anything else up there, but once these rights disappear, you can't get them back again. They're gone forever. And the way in which Langford Common or Langford Heathfield started to be run then and is run now, I don't agree with. And I think it's right that the local people should retain those rights. And indeed, the people in Langford Village have a right to pick up and burn in their fires any fallen timber on the common. They can't fell timber, but if it falls over, they are entitled to take it off the common and burn it. There was a man called Wilson Brewer who Brewer family lived in the village generations. Wilson Brewer had a bicycle where he took off the seat and put on an extra pair of handlebars. And then he would tie the timber between the two sets of handlebars on the bicycle and take it all back to his house.
Fantastic. Yeah, great.
He was a real character. Yeah. And I can remember seeing Wilson doing that many, many times.
The number of commoners now is nothing like a reflection on the number of commoners who would have existed originally. All that reflects is that's the few larger landowners who were informed by the National Farmers Union, or as it was in those days, the Countryside Landowners Association, to register their rights in 1963. Yes. Everybody else didn't know anything about it and lost their rights.
So is that really the case? Have you spoken to people who said, well, we didn't know anything about it?
They're dead now, but I have in the past,
really?
yes. There's a couple of people in the village who used to come down here. One old boy used to bring like a sort of wheelbarrow thing and take some firewood. And I had a chat with him one day, and his family, they say he was the last of the line, but they'd lived in the village for over 200 years, he told me, and had always come here and done that.
Really?
But he would never have heard that he had to register his rights. I don't really know what the process behind that Registration Act was. I don't know what paperwork people had to produce to show they had been using.
Yeah.
My hunch is not a lot, because to be perfectly honest, on this common and another one that in the past I managed, the list of things that people claimed they did were fanciful, to say the least.
Do you think they had over-enthusiastic lawyers?
Probably,
well,
or land agents.
That,
yeah, but it makes me suspect that there wasn't much requirement for evidence.
The people who registered their rights in the 60s tended to be the landowning commoners. Yet there were many more non-landowning commoners whose rights were by custom rather than formally attached to property. The guy who David told us about who collected wood in a wheelbarrow, or Wilson Brewer who adapted his bike. It may have been the same person. These people appear not to have known they had to register to keep their rights, and now those are permanently lost.
I'm just wondering about the future. Do you think that there might be a time in the future when people might want to use those common rights again?
Well, they're going to have a job to use them in the future if they're not registered to use them. Because they cannot believe that the owners of the commons, Somerset Wildlife Trust, are going to create any more commoners.
No, I think you're right.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
And so they're gone for good.